Hi, my name is Olivier Sylvain, and I'm a professor of law at Fordham University School of Law in New York City. Um, my specialty is in information law and communications law and public law generally. I am grateful to Christian Ione for inviting me to give this talk, uh, even if I was actually originally supposed to give it in person in Reggio Emilia. I regret that I have not been able to make it. Our communications crossed, but really my schedule has made it difficult to come. I wish at some point that I can make it. I hope that this video stands as something as a decent replacement. And I'm sorry I'm going to miss the discussion about all these related issues during the course of the day. Uh, what Christian has asked me to do is talk a little bit about a project that I feel lucky to have been involved in for the past year and a half. And that is a National Science Foundation project in the United States to prototype a edge cloud computing network in Harlem. Uh, Harlem is a storied place. There are people around the world who recognize Harlem for the riches it's given the world in the context of art and jazz in particular. And it continues to be a thriving place for culture and cultural production. Um, but there can be little doubt that Harlem is also plagued by a long-standing neglect in a variety of settings. The one I will be talking about is in the delivery of communications and broadband service. But the truth is that Harlem is still in a neglected community in the way that many African American communities and underserved communities of people of color have been treated in the United States. That doesn't color, so to speak, the project, but it does underscore the nature of its urgency. The NSF project is addressed to developing an alternative way of making computing available to communities that have been underserved. And Harlem is such a community. To give you a sense of what it looks like, Harlem is in one of the wealthiest parts of the world in Manhattan. But it is also a community that has not benefited from the riches that inure to lower Manhattan or Eastern or the Upper East Side. So this is part of what's drawn me to a project like this. I've written generally about um, um, inequalities and inequities in the delivery of communication services in the United States. This project a means to transform that disadvantage into an advantage. And that is by leapfrogging over broadband internet access technology and developing an edge cloud technology network that makes computing easier for people in Harlem. And one of the core pieces of this project is to move away from a system that privileges incumbents. And when I say incumbents, I mean the traditional broadband and internet service providers, to one that is based on a collaboration of stakeholders in Harlem, which would include civic organizations, businesses, universities, and residents and government officials. And this model, loosely based on scholarship that Christian Ione and his colleague and his friend and colleague, my friend and colleague Sheila Foster, Georgetown have developed, serves as a kind of framework for thinking about the alternative way of delivering service. The NSF issued a invitation for proposals that would help to connect communities. It's actually it's called the Connected Communities Program. And our application to the NSF meant to do two things. One, we wanted to deploy, harness uh, emerging technologies for the development of edge cloud computing. And on the other hand, we wanted to harness, develop, tap into the social science and social theory that Sheila Foster and Christian Ione have been developing in the context of community-based, um, commons-based urban governance for a commons resource like communications. And so this is what our project is meant to achieve, and we are only really in the beginnings of doing it. The collaboration entails not just tapping into communities in Harlem, but the researchers behind the project are engineers, um, electrical engineers, computer scientists from University of Arizona and University of Virginia, and Sheila is at Georgetown University, and I'm at Fordham University. We've also been helped substantially. Really, it's been indispensable, the help of a local civic organization by the name of Silicon Harlem. Silicon Harlem has been servicing the community in Harlem in a variety of fronts. It provides educational programs for internet access. It provides platforms, actual platforms for the delivery of service. And they've been ahead of the curve in trying to amend or alleviate what we call in the United States the digital divide for communities that are underserved in Harlem in particular. So the NSF project in this regard means to further this interest in developing an edge cloud computing network for underserved, underprivileged communities. The technology for this, I have to admit, I'm no expert in. But the idea is to locate a stack of servers in a residential area, let's say a public housing community, down in a basement, right, or in a cellar, that is administered by a designated trustee. And I'll talk about this in a moment. Uh, but to keep it simple, this server actually um, helps to transmit wireless service to devices throughout the housing community. And all of these devices are equipped with the capability of receiving and sending wireless signals, but not much more. We call them dumb devices, or what some of the engineers call a zero client. They are not like laptops. They're not like um, tablets or phones. Their capability for native computing is very low. The idea is that all of the computing, all the data processing happens at the processor level, that is, at the server level, in these large servers at the cluster of a housing unit. And wirelessly connected, the idea is that one would be able to engage in all kinds of work with a dumb device. Word processing, gaming, video streaming, and all kinds of other applications through a wireless network, again, that is administered by us by server operated at the in the local community, and to put it crass, in the cellar. I can say much more about the technology, but I'll spare you. A, because I might botch it, but also B, because it's not relevant for what I want to convey. All right, so enough of that. I think one of the some of the key pieces of what we're trying to do that I think would be useful for you all to understand is how to develop this project in a way that is consonant with this view about um, uh, engaging and collaborating with community members in ways that is an alternative to the prevailing approach relies on incumbents. And we've tried to come up with a variety of ways of doing this. First, we have to be able to map the relevant stakeholders. That is, who are the actual members of the community that we need to engage? Second, we have to come up with a way of governing this network and resource in a way that is consistent with its objectives. And then as an academic matter, as a research matter, we need to be able to test its success. I'm going to talk about these each in turn. I don't want to spend too much more time on this. But these identify some of the key questions that we will be asking. First, we have to be able to define who the community of users are. And for the purposes of our project, we're limiting it to a certain specific housing project, a public housing project that has um, maybe 1,000 residents. And then in light of who that project is, we then have to identify who the relevant parties and institutions are that are critical to making this a success. And that will include engaging um, all manner of stakeholders. We might want to consider using resident schools. Right? Who are the parties that are in the community that might be helpful in engaging in development of the service? Schools, police departments, hospital, and other public services. But really, the key is engaging residents, stakeholders in this process, and that is what makes this alternative approach important. Um, and then the truth is there is some parts of the community might be resistant. There are older residents who will be unfamiliar with the technology, and then there are the incumbents, the ones that are actually providing service to these communities now, um, and would be resistant to an alternative competitor in the market. And we are now currently at the stage of trying to engage all of these stakeholders in convenings, what we've been calling convenings. We held one a couple months ago during something that's called Harlem Week. Through Silicon Harlem's substantial help, we've been convening groups of all kinds, namely residents, but all kinds of people coming in to engage them and informing them about the nature of this project. That's the easy part. The hard part is coming up with a way to make sure that this infrastructure is governed consistent with its objectives. And particular to the technology we are talking about, there are a variety of issues and dimensions that complicate the governance question. At least the reason it's complicated is because a network like this is hard to administer and govern when most people are not comfortable or familiar with the technology. And so there has to be a mechanism for governing this regime in a way that's efficient and productive on the one hand, but that is not subject to the limitations of what most people bring to discussion of technology, these technologies. So we've slowly come to the mind that we need to identify trustees, public trustees, capable of making decisions in the interest of the community. But this is a difficult sort of question. We see it across law, right? The identification of a trustee responsible for dispensing of an estate or for administering a fund. You entrust this trustee with an obligation, and we are at a nascent point where it's hard to know who that trustee is. Of course, as I've said, we have a partner in Silicon Harlem that's been essential to developing community connections and convening groups. But Silicon Harlem has its own pecuniary interests. And this is something for us to be mindful about all along. Uh, I list here some of the issues that are a little more specific on what on how this might be complicated. Um, and if I were there, I would invite you to ask questions about each of these. And finally, I want to identify how we might think of governance in this context. I said we need to find a trustee, but this isn't the end of the question. Part of this entails trying to define a structure for administering a regime. Do we want a governing board that comes from the community itself? Do we want an advisory board that is staffed with experts from outside the community? Do we want to be able to develop processes internal to the organization? Or do we want to wait for the community itself to formulate those standards rather than the researchers doing it? Do we want to find experts that will be responsible for this objective of the project, or do we expect the community residents to make decisions about who their representatives are? I don't have the answers for those, and those are the kinds of research questions we want to address in the next next year in particular. Our project is a 3 year long project. We're at the end of year one, where we've done a lot of groundwork, but I think the hard part of our project begins now when we start answering um, some of these questions. So I want to finish by saying that this is a project that means to transform the way in which residents engage in communications technology, that where they become uh, the managers, the administrators of the data that um, affects their interaction with the world online. This is an alternative to the intermediated broadband access that's made available by carriers and service providers. This is one that locates the power of decision making in communities and residents. And challenge for us is making sure that this works. On the one hand, to vindicate these kind of high-minded ideas, but on the other hand, it's actually practically possible in a day and age when technology seems opaque to so many of us. I have more to say about all of this. I've tried to keep this short, as short as possible. I hope this is helpful, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to give this talk.